Budget as presented just a week ago, and I know committee members will continue to arrive through the storm, and we welcome them as they do. I want to welcome our Vice Chair of the committee, Senator Nielsen. If you have something to offer at this time, feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this does begin a long and arduous process. It's always challenging, and hopefully this year maybe not as challenging as some years that we've had to suffer. It's been nice to see that we find ourselves in agreement with some of the contentions that the governor has made as we begin the year. We must keep in mind, though times are a little bit better, that some parts of our economy have not improved, and therefore we must exercise restraint and not get overly ambitious, and that will be what governs our progress in the budget. Let's not get overly ambitious, and let's not let government get out of control. Let's look to the future and plan for the future, keeping in mind the problems we've had in the past by being overly ambitious.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to be hearing, of course, from the Department of Finance as well as from the Legislative Analyst's Office. We do intend to leave some time at the end of the hearing for public comment. I know there are many people here who probably have a few things to offer to the committee. And I would agree with Senator Nielsen that this is going to be a relatively positive year. The numbers continue to look good, as the governor was very adamant in his presentation that as we are entering the 7th year of our economic recovery, on average since World War II, recoveries lasting 5 years, it shouldn't surprise any of us that a recession is ahead. The question is when, not if. At the same time, with an additional $2 billion set aside into the voter-created rainy day fund, above and beyond what the voters told us they would like to see in it, that I think will be at least part of the playing field as to our debate. What is appropriate for continuing payment of debt and for reserves, at the same time recognizing that so many of Californians who had been hurt at the time of the recession have not seen much recovery or reinvestment in the programs upon which they rely for their quality of life. So I think that's really where we'll be talking about things in the months ahead. So with that, Ms. Bosler, if you'd like to join us, please, and Mr. Taylor, if you'd like to join us as well, we can get going on our hearing. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're just short of a quorum, so we'll wait another member or two. Ms. Bosler, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman and Senators. My name is Keely Bosler, and I'm the Chief Deputy Director with the Department of Finance, and it's my pleasure to be here today to present to you the 2016-17 Governor's Budget. And I did bring a few slides to help me walk through this presentation today, and they should be before you on the dais. I'm very happy to report, as the chairman mentioned, that the state's economy continues to strengthen, and with that, increased state revenues are coming into the state. In fact, this budget proposal revises our revenue estimates up $5.9 billion estimates that were used in the 2015 Budget Act. This enables this budget to provide the highest level ever funding for our K-14 schools. It also enables us to maintain the affordability of our higher education system, and also with some of the one-time revenues that the state is receiving, also includes a significant investment in the state's infrastructure. As the chairman mentioned, the proposal also continues efforts to save for a rainy day and the possibility of a recession in the near future, and also continues to pay down the state's debts and liabilities. But despite all of these good things, the budget in the state of California does remain precariously balanced over the long term. In our estimates, the budget has an operating deficit of nearly $2 billion by 2019-20. And that just assumes the existing obligations that the state has, as well as the targeted new obligations that are proposed in the governor's budget. It also, of course, includes the expiration of the Proposition 30 revenues, which start to expire at the end of this calendar year. And while there's significant uncertainty in forecasts, there is one thing that is quite certain, and that is history. And if you look back at the last 15 years that are on the second slide in your packet, you will see that there are times of balance in California have been quickly followed by huge deficits. And it's this boom and bust cycle that this budget really aims to avoid going forward.
Ms. Boswell, we're going to take just a second and call the roll so we can
Absolutely.
establish our quorum. Thank you.
Leno,
Here.
Nielsen,
Here.
Allen, Anderson, Bell, Block, Hancock, Mitchell, Monning, Morlock, Nguyen, Pan, Pabley, Roth, Stone, Woke. We have a quorum.
Thank you.
And one of the drivers of these boom and bust cycles has been the underlying revenues that come into the state and the reliance on the personal income tax, and especially one component of the personal income tax, and that's capital gains. And this third chart, which is quite familiar to many of you, it's one that we've used for the last several years. We chart out capital gains over time. And as you can see, it is quite volatile. In this budget in 2015, we predict the highest level of capital gains realizations ever, and that's at just under 135 billion. And so while capital gains are up right now, as history has shown us, they will come down and they will have a significant negative impact on the state's revenues. In addition, also as the chairman had mentioned, the state is currently in its 7th year of economic expansion. This is 2 years longer than the average length of expansion post-World War II. With this, every month that goes by, every year that goes by, the likelihood of the state facing another recession is inevitable. This year, the Department of Finance revenue forecasting and economic staff did put together a recession scenario for illustration purposes. There is not a recession built into the main budget forecast that this budget is built on, but for illustration purposes, we did put together a recession forecast just to illustrate the impact of just a moderate recession would have on the state's budget. In our recession scenario, that's modeled more off of the magnitude of the early 2000 dot-com bust, we would term a moderate recession that starts in 2017-18. Over a 3-year period, the state could lose up to $55 billion in revenues. And with this reduced revenues, there would also be reduced spending on the Proposition 98 guarantee. But even with the level of spending proposed in the governor's budget, the state would be faced with a $29 billion deficit by the end of 2019-20. On the next slide, we show what would happen, though, under more significant investments in ongoing programmatic expenditures this year. I will talk more about roughly $4 billion in one-time investments that this budget makes. But if those $4 billion in one-time investments were instead programmed into ongoing expenditures, the state could easily be faced with a $43 billion deficit by the end of 2019-20, which would eclipse the Great Recession that the state most recently had. So with all of this, this budget really makes a particular focus on investing one-time revenues for one-time investments, and also continues the commitment that the administration has had over the last several years to pay down the state's debts and liabilities, and also to save for a rainy day. The budget does include the Proposition 2 that the voters passed in 2014 sets aside $2.6 billion in additional revenues into the rainy day fund. This includes $995 million related to the true up for the 2015-16 year, and then an additional $1.6 billion in the budget year. In addition, $1.6 billion are also used to pay down the state's debts and liabilities, including special fund loans, as well as transportation loans. Also, past liabilities owed under the Proposition 98 guarantee. And then finally, also pays down the second year of a commitment to the UC related to their retirement liability. But as the chairman said in his opening remarks, the budget, in addition to these deposits that are happening on the natural due to the Constitution, the budget does makes a policy choice to deposit an additional $2 billion into the rainy day fund. This will bring the rainy day fund to a level of $8 billion, which is 65% of the target set in the Constitution of 10% of general fund revenues. In addition to this additional savings that's reflected in the governor's budget, the administration continues to work towards eliminating some of our debts and liabilities. Last year in the budget, we proposed to eliminate the state's retiree health unfunded liability. This liability has grown to $72 billion in the budget year, and will grow to nearly $300 billion over the next 3 decades if left unaddressed. And you can see that in the next chart. As we continue to implement the proposal that was laid out last year in the budget, which is to work with our employee bargaining units through collective bargaining to achieve a 50-50 cost sharing of a pre-funding system for our retiree health. This will both help the state to manage through the next recession and also to preserve this important benefit to our state's employees. This budget does make a significant investment in our state, in our K-14 schools by providing the highest level ever Proposition 98 guarantee at $71.6 billion. This enables a $2.8 billion increase to the local control funding formula that's allocating monies to the neediest students and is enabling schools across the state to reduce class sizes, hire teachers, and implement other services and supports at their local schools, all governed by local control accountability plans that are discussed and debated locally, and expenditure plans that are determined locally. The budget also continues investments in higher education with a particular emphasis on maintaining the affordability of the state's higher education system. This budget will contain the 5th year of no tuition increases at both UC and CSU, and it also provides an additional investment of $160 million for both the UC and CSU systems. This is on top of the nearly $761 million that has been provided to UC over the last several years, and $866 million that's been provided to CSU over the last several years. The budget also has $737 million in new resources for the community colleges, including a new initiative related to developing no-cost degrees for students here in California as an option. The budget continues to have an emphasis on strengthening paths through education and then into the workforce. And to do this, we include additional money for improving the state's remediation programs for students that do come to college but are not ready for college-level work. Also continue to the hard work of improving the transfers between community colleges and the universities. And also additional emphasis on improving graduation rates, especially at our individual CSU campuses. And the budget does call for the CSU trustees to reach beyond the goals that they set in their sustainability plan. There's also $200 million in the community college budget to invest in a new strong workforce program. Another way to say the strong workforce program is career technical education. And this is really building on years of work that the community colleges have been doing with their local workforce investment boards to align the training to the jobs that are available in their particular region. And then finally, we continue our efforts to support success for all students and through targeted investments at the community college level. This budget also makes investments in counteracting the effects of poverty and does provide a cost of living adjustment for SSI, SSP recipients, which is the first time that there's been a state COLA since 2006. The state continues the work of implementing the historic healthcare reform, including the optional expansion that extended healthcare coverage to millions of childless adults with no children, and also parent and caretaker relatives with slightly higher incomes. These are persons that had never had access to the state's Medi-Cal program before. And the budget reflects the first time the state is starting to share in the costs of this optional expansion, with $740 million general fund, reflecting a half a year of the 5% cost share that the state has. The state's cost share will continue to grow over the next several years until it reaches 10% in 2020. And as part of our long-term effort to fund our healthcare system, the budget also contains managed care organization financing reform, an effort to really look at our healthcare industry and restructure the way that industry pays taxes in order to maximize the federal funds that the state is receiving. We also are in the midst of receiving tax returns for the first California earned income tax credit, and the budget does set aside $380 million for the second year of this important program that was part of the budget agreement that was implemented last year. As I mentioned already, we continue to implement the local control funding formula, getting more money to those schools that have a higher proportion of students living in poverty. And then finally, this administration has made significant gains for workers across the state of California by extending mandatory sick leave to 6.5 million workers, and also by increasing the minimum wage by 25%, with the latest increase going into effect just this past January. The budget also contains, as I mentioned in my opening, significant investment in strengthening the state's infrastructure. We see the increased one-time revenues that the state is receiving as an opportunity to really make some investments in the infrastructure that we have here in the state of California that will be here for many, many decades to come. The first proposal is an $807 million effort to pay down and to work through a long list of deferred maintenance items in state facilities across the state, including our state parks, correctional institutions, our state hospitals, and many other of our state's buildings. The budget also contains a $1.5 billion transfer to an infrastructure fund to finance on a pay-as-you-go basis the reform, restoration, and replacement of 2 office buildings here in central Sacramento, as well as the building that we're all sitting in here today, the State Capitol Annex. These are buildings that are all 50-plus years and have aged electrical and mechanical systems and have become much more difficult to repair when things do occur, and have been evaluated as and found to be of the most the least modern in terms of the safety standards that are currently standard in all new buildings. The budget also continues to include the governor's transportation financing package that was discussed late in the session last year. This is a $3.6 billion ongoing revenue package that would help to chip away at the significant deficit in funding that's needed to maintain our state and local roads. The focus of this package is maintaining our existing state and local roads, but also makes investments to expand transit and also to make targeted investments in our key trade corridors around the state. The financing package also includes reforms, including streamlined project delivery, targeted CEQA exemptions, increased staffing flexibilities at Caltrans for delivering those projects, as well as sets performance measures for the expenditure of the state funds on the state system. In addition to the $3.6 billion in additional revenues, the budget also pledges $879 million in general fund for the early repayment of transportation loans that were taken out during the recession. And I will end with the budget's with climate change. This budget contains a major cap and trade expenditure plan of $3.1 billion to continue to make move the state forward in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions on our transportation system, as well as reducing short-lived climate pollutants, and also make significant investments in our natural ecosystems and their carbon sequestration benefits. And then finally, this proposal also has a special emphasis on local climate change and actions at the local level, especially those in disadvantaged communities. The state, despite the weather we're having this morning and the welcome reprieve of rain we've gotten over the last several weeks, the state does continue to be faced with a drought, and many of our, and we're in the 5th year of that drought, and our reservoirs continue to be at very low levels. Many groundwater aquifers are severely depleted, and it will take many years of above average in order to regain their health. And so with that, we do have a $719 million general fund package that will continue the support to those communities that are the most impacted by drought. There's also additional monies to deal with the real realities of the severe fire seasons that we had this past year and will likely have in the upcoming year, and then also an additional $200 million that is dealing with continued cleanup of the devastation that occurred this past fall in both Lake counties and Calaveras counties, and the many, many thousands of people that lost their homes. And so with that overview, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bosler, and thank you also for the nifty handout. It does help focus one's assessment of such a document as complex as the budget, so we appreciate that. And colleagues, I'm going to suggest that we hold our questions for Ms. Bosler right now until after we hear from Mr. Taylor. Then we can start with our questions and begin our conversation with both of them. So, Mr. Taylor, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members. About a week ago, my office put out our annual overview of the budget. I hope that you have that in your packet. I may refer to just a couple of charts, but I really just wanted to speak briefly to some of the high-level comments that we made in our initial assessment of the governor's proposal. Let me just start by reiterating what Ms. Bosler said. These are very good times, budgetarily speaking. The economy has been performing in California very well, driven in large part by the Bay Area. Revenues have been coming in very strongly. The administration's numbers are up, as Ms. Bosler noted. They're very similar to where we were last May and almost identical to where we were in our November fiscal outlook. As a result, we feel like the administration's revenue numbers are an excellent starting point for you. As she noted, they could change as we get our numbers on estimated payments in the next few days and find out what happens in April. But for now, I think you can use those numbers as your starting point. Let me start with just some comments about the overall structure of the budget. If you turn to page 8 of the overview, there's a chart there at the bottom of page 8, which shows you how the governor allocated the discretionary revenues in the budget. That is after you pay for Prop 98 and Proposition 2 requirements and caseload adjustments. Where did the governor make his choices about how to allocate funds? Clearly, you will be making different choices. That's what the budget is all about. But I think that it does show you some of the key decisions that are in front of you. You see that the governor put a lot of money into optional reserves. That is in addition to what Proposition 2 required. He not only put the $2 billion that the chair referred to in additional funds into the budget stabilization account, but the free surplus, or the SFEU as we call it, it also increases by $1.1 billion. Those are monies that are available for you for any purposes. The governor also commits a large part of discretionary revenues to one-time infrastructure. Again, we commend the governor for the emphasis on infrastructure. It's one of the most important things that the state does, in my opinion. And then there are certain commitments, ongoing spending commitments that the governor's made. And I think it's interesting to note the MCO tax, which the governor assumes will be passed and commits a small portion of the monies to IHSS, but in effect leaves $1.1 billion uncommitted. Those would also be available for whatever purpose that you decided to use them for. So in thinking then about your overall budget structure, I think it's important to start with a decision about what level of reserves do you want. And in thinking about that, you shouldn't just focus on the BSA, the Budget Stabilization Account. I think you should focus on all your reserves in the SFEU and the BSA, because that is what is available to you should the economy go south quickly. And there are distinctions between the two, which we'll get into. But you need to start at what is an appropriate level from your perspective. The administration has said, we would like to have total reserves in both the BSA and the SFEU of about 8.5% to 9% by the end of this coming budget year. Well, that's reasonable. Do you want that rough amount? Do you want more? What is the level that you'd like to be at when things turn south? Do you want to be at 10%? 11? Do you want to be where the governor is now? That's your choice. There's no right answer. And part of it, it's your comfort level about both, one, how much more steam do you think the economy has? How much longer will the economy continue to grow? And your sort of risk trade-off, your risk aversion on the kind of decisions you have to make when your budget does turn south. Those are your own sort of personal calculus, and I can't tell you what the right amount is. I think that the 10% level that was in the BSA is the maximum. It's a pretty good target overall for your level of reserves. Do you want to get there, though? Even if you were to pick that, do you want to get there at the end of this year, at the end of 17-18, at the end of 18-19? Just sort of keep that in mind about what your target is, because that does help constrain the other decisions you make on various spending commitments. The second issue, though, is even if you pick a reserve level, is what is the mix between the BSA and the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties. At this time, we would probably caution you not to put extra money into the BSA. That doesn't mean you still can't set it aside in your free surplus, but once you put it in the BSA, it's governed by the rules of the BSA. And for example, you can only take out half of the monies if you had a downturn in the BSA. And it might be, you could imagine a situation in which you wanted to take out more in the first year. So it's not a terrible idea what the governor's proposing, but I think I would focus more on the overall level of the reserves, not so much of whether it's in the BSA or your free surplus. So after you make that sort of, I think, key decision about what your targets are for reserve levels, then you have to decide, well, you have money left over for making some new spending commitments. And I think it is a key decision on how much is one-time versus ongoing. Clearly, the more that you spend on one-time things, the sort of safer you are should you have a downturn because you have less to cut back on your ongoing commitments. But again, that's a choice that you have to make. Now, when it comes to one-time spending, the governor has focused on infrastructure. And again, we think that's a very positive thing. But just keep in mind, you have other one-time things that you can spend on. We have very high-cost pension and health retiree liabilities that are accruing cost at 7.5% a year. So you may want to make additional payments to help fund those and pay some of those liabilities off. Again, there's no right choice, but just remember, the more important thing is the one-time, the mix of one-time versus ongoing. And when you think about your one-time expenditures, you have a whole array of choices to make on those. Then you get down to sort of, well, okay, you have money that we can commit to ongoing spending programs, and or spending or revenue reductions if you want to increase the EITC or provide other tax credits or things like that. I'm just talking about ongoing commitments. And clearly, in this situation, I think you need to think about the MCO tax as sort of a key factor in this. And that's for very practical reasons. The MCO tax is one of several medical provider taxes that the legislature has passed. And you've done that not really related to budgetary issues, just the state of your budget, as much as you're able to leverage federal monies. The federal government allows you to do these things. But in this case, if you were to have an MCO tax of the magnitude that the governor is proposing, that would provide over $1 billion in funds that would be available. And the thing about those monies is they're in effect more stable than your revenue structure. It's the federal government for at least 3 years or whatever they decided to approve it for. You would in effect have those monies. They wouldn't be subject in effect to the same kind of volatility as revenues coming in from capital gains taxes. So I think whether you do the MCO tax or not is an important factor in the calculus of how much one-time versus ongoing spending you can feel comfortable with. But I think those are some of the key factors you have to think about in sort of developing your overall budget approach. Let me just turn real quickly to a couple of program-specific things. First, on Proposition 98, it is important to realize that the budget includes a lot more revenue, again, for schools. They do very well. The governor continues to put the majority of the money in K-12 into the local control funding formula, which has been something that the legislature, I think, has expressed strong support for. The one-time monies, there's about $1.3 billion in one-time monies because of increases in the guarantee in past years. And the governor, again, uses that to retire mandates. The way we've been retiring them, it's a very slow process. You spend $1.3 billion to pay off about $780 million just because of the way the mandate liabilities are distributed. We hope to have some ideas for you on how you might retire those mandates a little bit faster. We think that you may have up to $1 billion more in property taxes than what the administration is reflecting. If that's true, that would reduce your school spending and would free up money that's available for, again, whatever purposes that you feel are appropriate. Ms. Bosler, I think, mentioned the restructuring proposals in both preschool and in childcare. I think the administration's approach generally, we feel, has merit. You have complicated formulas addressing different students in both your preschool and your child care, and we think the overall attempt, as we see the governor's proposal, to simplify that and to focus funds on the neediest kids makes a lot of sense, but you do have a lot of work in front of you, and my colleagues will be working on providing more information for you and options in how you think about that. Ms. Bosler mentioned the proposal to add money for CTE. Our concern here is not necessarily with the overall amount of money, but one of our problems is that we have billions of dollars on workforce education. We have 30 different programs, all overlapping, and here we're adding another program. And so I think what you need to think about is how do we best deliver the monies that are being dedicated, whether it's with the $200 million or not. Let me just finish up with some comments about infrastructure. Again, we want to commend the governor for highlighting this area, but I think we do have a lot of questions. The governor's putting about $2.5 billion when you count the $1.5 billion for state facilities, the deferred maintenance. He has a local jail proposal also, so there's a lot of money there. And I think, first of all, you have to think about, are these the most important infrastructure projects in your view? So that you might feel like, I think the legislature should commit a large proportion of whatever one-time monies we spend on infrastructure. Are these the most important ones in your view? It may be that even in the state buildings, are these the highest priority state buildings that you want to spend on? I think you do want to make sure you have the information that you need in making these decisions. For example, on the buildings, that's a lot of money the administration's proposing, and yet you don't have the sequencing plan for downtown office space that the legislature had asked for. That's a crucial piece of information in deciding about which buildings, if any, that you fund. And I think you want to be careful about maintaining your oversight. The administration is proposing a continuous appropriation of the $1.5 billion into the state infrastructure fund. We would strongly recommend that you not do that. You don't want to lose control. I think you've already lost way too much authority over capital outlay projects. You've given it to both the universities and the administration. Stop doing that. I think you should be exerting a lot more control over capital outlay projects than you have in the past, than you used to do. With that, though, Mr. Chairman, let me close and just say that my colleagues are, as we speak, working on providing more detailed analysis, which will be coming out in the next few weeks. And as always, we look forward to providing whatever help to you and your staff that we can in developing a 2016-17 budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor.